Chapter 9 of Stories from God's Holy Book by Josephine Looney. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Therese. The Giant Killer. Bobby was looking out of the window. There was an ivy vine climbing up the wall of the house next door, and Bobby watched it swing back and forth in the wind. Suddenly it gave him an idea. "Let's play Jack and the Beanstalk," he suggested. "I'll be Jack and you be the giant." "I won't," replied Patricia crossly. "I don't like giants. They're mean." "You're mean too, if you won't do what I want," Bobby retorted. Joe looked from one to the other with a certain expression on her face. The children understood that expression very well. "I'm sorry I was cross," said Patricia. "I'm sorry I said that to you," said Bobby. Joe smiled again. "Jack's giant was just a make-believe giant," she observed. "I know a story about a boy who killed a real giant." Delightedly the children sat down to listen to the story. "Was he a little boy like me?" from Bobby. "What was his name?" from Patricia. "He was just a few years older than you, Bobby. His name was David. Although David wasn't a big boy, he was a very brave one. He wasn't afraid of anything in the world. This was because he loved God so much. He knew that God watched over him all the time." "Where did he live?" questioned Patricia. "He lived in Palestine. He was one of God's people, the Jews. You remember that God led the Jews back to Palestine from Egypt. Many years after that, David was born. David was a shepherd boy. He took care of his father's sheep out on the hills. Sheep are very easy to take care of. They just move along slowly, eating grass. So David had plenty of time to practice with his slingshot. You have seen slingshots that are toys, but in those days the slingshot wasn't a toy. It was a real weapon. It was quite large and made of leather and string and would throw stones with great force. David got to be so good at hitting targets that he could beat all the other shepherd boys. He would take out his slingshot, put a smooth stone in the leather bag, whirl it round and round, and then let it go. And away the stone would fly almost as fast as a bullet. "I'd like to have a slingshot," Bobby interjected. "It must be fun." Now some enemies came into the land. They were called Philistines. The ruler of the Jews, King Saul, led his soldiers out against them. The two armies came face to face. Saul and his men camped on one mountain. The Philistines camped on the mountain just opposite. One of the Philistine warriors was a ferocious giant named Goliath. On his head he wore a great helmet of brass. On his body was heavy armor made of big metal scales. His legs were covered with metal too, and he carried an immense spear. "I'd keep away from him," cried Patricia. "So did Saul's men," answered Joe. For 40 days the giant started up and down in front of the Philistines' camp. "Come and fight me," he roared out across the valley to the Jewish soldiers. But no one dared go and fight Goliath. Then, one day, David came to the camp. He was bringing food to his grown-up brothers who were soldiers in Saul's army. He heard Goliath roaring on the opposite mountain, and he said, "I will fight Goliath. I am not afraid." At first King Saul said, "No, you are just a boy and that giant would kill you." But David told Saul how he had once killed a lion and a bear that came to carry off his father's sheep. He caught them by the throat and choked them to death. "We are God's people," said David. "He will help me kill this enemy, just as he helped me kill the lion and the bear." At last King Saul said David could fight the giant. But first he had David dressed in armor from head to foot. David wasn't used to such heavy clothing. He couldn't walk in it. So he took off the coat of armor and the helmet and the brass leggings. He went to meet Goliath dressed as he always was in his little shepherd's coat. He carried only his slingshot and 5 smooth stones which he found in the brook. Goliath couldn't help laughing at such a sight. Then he yelled out that he would tear David to pieces and give his flesh to the birds and beasts. David replied, "You are fighting against me with a sword, but I am fighting against you in the name of the Lord. He doesn't need a sword to conquer you." The children were jumping with excitement. "What happened then, Joe?" "David put a stone in his slingshot," Joe replied. "He whirled it round and round with all his might. He let go. The stone flew out and hit Goliath right between the eyes. He fell face downward on the mountainside. David ran forward. He picked up Goliath's sword and cut off his head. Then he held the head up for all the soldiers to see. "What did the enemies do then?" Bobby demanded. "They ran away as fast as they could," answered Joe. "Of course Saul's soldiers were very happy, and everyone said that David was the bravest person in the land. But David did not forget that God had taken care of him. He loved God all the more." "Did David do any more brave things?" asked Bobby. "Many more," answered Joe. "When he grew up, the people made him king. He led them in many successful battles against their enemies. He was king for 40 years and did many good things for his people. When he was very old, he had his son Solomon made king. Just before he died, he said to Solomon, 'Remember always to walk in the ways of the Lord and keep His commandments.'" "The same commandments God gave Moses on the mountain?" Patricia wanted to know. "The very same," said Joe. End of chapter 9.